Okay, so just before we get to our scripture reading, I'd like to close the gap between last week and this week, just like I had to do the week before that too. So slide 1. You remember this neat little family tree that I did up? Do we have it? There it is. Hey, remember that? If you were here last week or you watched last week's service, you remember it. I invite you to go find it. These are the patriarchs, the 3 little hearts there, and their wives and families, beginning in Genesis 12 with Abraham and Sarah, the first people with whom God made a promise or a pact. I will be your God, and you will be my people. I'll bless you in order that all the nations of the world will be blessed. And so we've got Abraham, and we've got Isaac, his son, and then his son Jacob. Last week we talked a bit about one of the kids from the 4th generation of that covenant, one of Jacob's sons, Joseph. Yes, the one with the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and the smash Broadway hit featuring Donny Osmond. That Joseph. Well, while Joseph worked to make reparations with his brothers who had wronged him, he also secured his role as second in command to Pharaoh after interpreting some of the king's dreams. Joe suggested that there were ways to prepare for 7 years of famine that were being predicted through Pharaoh's dreams. So he got the job. That's what happens in church, right? You make a suggestion and then someone goes, that's great, you do it. That's biblical. So Genesis ends with Joseph moving his whole extended family to a land called Goshen on the outskirts of Egypt and caring for them just as he cared for the Egyptian people. Joseph ended up having 2 boys. He bore 2 sons with his Egyptian wife, and he lived to the ripe old age of 110. So anyone in the congregation right now hitting their 90s, you still have a way to go. You still have a way to go. That's how the book of Genesis ends. And it's all good in the hood so far. But listen to how the next book, listen to how Exodus starts. It says, then Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, the Egyptians set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. But the more that they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Within a generation or 2 of Joseph's death, the Israelites lacked a political protector, and they became slaves to their Egyptian landlords, eventually overlords. Their numbers grew to the thousands, but still they were crushed under the oppression of Egypt. The Israelites reduced to total enslavement. They were just property for 4 centuries. Now, there's a whole story about Moses that we're not going to get into this year, so come back next September. His origin story is worthy of a sermon or 2 on its own, as is his adolescence, the murder he committed, fun fact, and the running away and rediscovery of self. His call story is the one from which the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the Presbyterian Church around the world, gets its logo, the burning bush. Unfortunately, we're skipping past all of that today and getting to the part where after 9 plagues and multiple failed attempts to convince Pharaoh to let the people of God go, Moses goes to the Israelites and warns them that a 10th plague is about to descend on all of Egypt. It will be the worst one yet, the death of the firstborn. It will be enough to break Pharaoh's hardened heart. So fill your bellies this evening, Pack whatever you can carry. Don't wait for your bread to rise. Put on your sandals and cloaks if you have them, because tonight they would be walking out of Egypt forever. John.
If you would like to read with me, you can find the passages of Exodus 14, verse 5 to 7, and then verses 10 to 14, and then verses 21 to 29 on page 53 to 54 in your Pew Bible. But that's not going to help you very much, because I am reading from my translation, from Robert Alter's translation of the 5 books of Moses. They're close enough. You'll be fine. Jesus, help us to wrestle with this beautiful and terrible text, and help us not to let go until we get a blessing. So starting at verse 5. And it was told to the king of Egypt that the people had fled. And Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart about the people. And they said, "What is this we have done, that we sent off Israel from our service?" And he harnessed his chariot, and his troops he took with him. And he took 600 picked chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt, and captains over it all. And now verse 10. And Pharaoh drew near, and the Israelites raised their eyes, and look, Egypt was advancing toward them, and they were very afraid. And the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "Was it for lack of graves in Egypt that you took us to die in the wilderness? What is this you have done to us to bring us out of Egypt? Isn't this the thing we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve Egypt, for it is better for us to serve Egypt than for us to die in the wilderness?'" And Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Take your station and see the Lord's deliverance that he will do for you today. For as you see the Egyptians today, you shall not see them again for all time. The Lord shall do battle for you, and you shall keep still." And now verses 21 to 29. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord let the sea with a mighty east wind all night, and he made the sea dry ground, and the waters were split apart. And the Israelites came into the sea on dry land, the waters a wall to them on their right and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and came after them, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his riders into the sea. And it happened in the morning watch, that the Lord looked out over the camp of Egypt in a pillar of fire and cloud, and he panicked the camp of Egypt. And he took off the wheels of their chariots and drove them heavily. And Egypt said, "Let me flee before Israel, for the Lord does battle for them against Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters go back over the Egyptians, over their chariots, and over their riders." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea went back toward morning to its full flow, with the Egyptians fleeing toward it. And the Lord shook out the Egyptians into the sea. And the waters came back and covered the chariots and the riders of all Pharaoh's force who were coming after them in the sea. Not a single one of them remained. And the Israelites went on dry land in the midst of the sea, the waters a wall to them on their right and on their left. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Amen.